for the economy? Do we need tighter restrictions on student visas? And do you know what's in your vape? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP and former Minister Vicky Ford, Shadow International Development Minister Preet Gill, Conservative Home columnist Emily Carver and New Statesman writer Harry Lambert. Today, has the UK economy turned a corner?
Together, these forecasts demonstrate that we're on the right path, but the job is not done yet.
As the International Monetary Fund upgrades its forecast for the UK economy, we ask if there are reasons to be cheerful. Also today,
I want to bring the levels of legal migration down.
To what?
Crystal clear about that. I'm not going to put a precise figure on it, but I do want to bring them down.
he says he wants to cut immigration, but how? Do we need tougher regulations on vaping devices?
We also found high levels of nickel, chromium and lead in these devices, all of these devices.
He was Deputy Prime Minister a month ago. Now he'll be leaving Parliament altogether.
Does the PM have confidence in you, Home Secretary?
And could Rishi Sunak be about to lose his fourth Cabinet Minister? Yes, let's start with the story you heard in the headlines there. BBC News, Dominic Raab to stand down as MP at next election. That was announced earlier on today. A month ago, of course, he resigned. He was Deputy Prime Minister up until then, but he quit after a bullying inquiry upheld 2 complaints against him. And there's been a fair share of turbulence under Rishi Sunak. Let's have a look at other Cabinet Ministers that have gone since he became Prime Minister. Gavin Williamson there. Last November resigned. Nadeem Zahawi was sacked over issues to do with his tax affairs in January. And as we say, now Dominic Raab. There is, of course, still a cloud hanging over the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, after the row over her speeding fine and how she handled it. She says she's confident nothing untoward has happened. But we're waiting to hear whether or not the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, will instruct his ethics advisor to launch an investigation into whether or not Suella Braverman broke the ministerial code. So my question to you all, starting with you, Vicky, is will Suella Braverman be the 4th Cabinet Minister to go?
Well, obviously, you know, the Prime Minister needs to look into that. Nobody should be above the law, but I think the Home Secretary was very clear yesterday that she had speeded, that she apologised for that, that she regretted that and she paid the fine. On Dominic, you know, it is really sad to see a lot of colleagues stepping down in this election. But, you know, it's a very different job to any other job because you commit for that entire 5-year time period. You can't walk away halfway through an election cycle. And colleagues have been thinking about the pressure on their families and some of them wanting to be spending time with children. So,
but what do you think is behind so many of your colleagues deciding to step down at the next election?
Well, a lot of us have not decided to step down, but I think also the last 2 elections have happened in quite a snap. So people haven't had that sort of time to think about it, think about what's going to be happening with their family over the next few years. So I can see that, you know, people like Dominic, who've put a long time into politics, held a lot of senior roles, wanting to spend a bit more time with his family now.
Preet, do you think Rishi Sunak is about to lose his 4th Cabinet Minister?
Well, I think Rishi Sunak, when he was appointed, made a lot out of having integrity and professionalism, and he sort of said, this is the bar. And what we've actually seen is very weak. He hasn't been able to sack any of them. I mean, you know, the process with Dominic Raab, the bullying being upheld, and now how much more does Suella Braverman have to do before he absolutely takes action and shows leadership? Let's see what happens, but I think it's very difficult for her to remain in her position, given what has gone on. But he's got to show some clear leadership. And
well, of course, he called various investigations, certainly into Dominic Raab. He's yet to decide in the case of Suella Braverman breaching the ministerial code or not. Do you think he's about to lose his 4th Cabinet Minister?
I don't think so. I think he needs her, and I think this story over a driving awareness course is pretty minor. I'm
I mean,
not sure
it's
the
about,
vast
of course, how
majority-
she handled it and whether
I
she
know,
instructed
but
civil
we've
servants.
seen these stories sort of rumble on. They're in the front pages. It's off most of the front pages now. And I think he'll probably let this one go. He needs Suella Braverman, to put it simply. She is the Home Secretary who is talking tough on immigration and trying to do something about illegal immigration, which are all thorny subjects. And Rishi Sunak has this Home Secretary that is able to talk tough on those topics.
Right. Does he need her? She won't go.
Yeah, potentially. I think Emily's right. Maybe slipping off the front pages doesn't make it right. You know, the key fact here is Braverman instructed her civil servants to potentially handle this for her, which is against the ministerial code.
Asked advice.
Well, fine, but she shouldn't be involving them at all in personal matters. I think the bigger point to make here is that Dominic Raab is nearly the 40th Tory MP to stand down. That's more than 10% of the party. It's a silent vote of no confidence, not really in Rishi, but in the party itself and its prospects. It does show you the way the wind is going. But I think also, please let's not take Raab's statement at face value. He's very likely to lose his seat. If
Yes,
it wasn't
he has a
likely,
very small majority as a target seat for the Liberal Democrats.
and if not, his ministerial career was over. You know, he was demoted, and he was forced to resign. So,
Emily?
I would just say it does make me wonder who would want to be an MP at this moment in time. The absolute abuse, the pressure, of course, on your family, social media, absolutely horrendous. You have civil service leaking stories about ministers.
We have lots of issues in this country. We certainly want to govern. I think if this government doesn't have the ideas and it feels it's very difficult, it just needs to step aside. I think she's a liability.
I know, but we saw
she
how
hasn't
Rachel
delivered
Reeves
anything on immigration.
was
Come
accused
on.
of great hypocrisy because her ticket for a flight was business class and then she changed it. You know, it's this
Emily,
sort
I'm
of
not talking
pathetic
about that. Look,
journalism,
I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is the bigger issues on immigration. She talks tough, she can't deliver. She doesn't have the confidence of her party. There's absolute chaos. There's lots of people in her party that don't agree with her stance because they know it's not going to make a difference. Actually, what's worrying me is her rhetoric and pitting communities against each other. That is not the way we do leadership or act as a Home Secretary. That's not grappling with the issues. And I'm sure we'll go on to some of the other wider issues that are going to come up. But certainly, I think this government is out of ideas and needs to step aside.
Vicky?
So, listen, of course we're having a difficult time. We've had a massive global pandemic and the government was absolutely right to support individual businesses through that. We've got war in Europe that's pushed up the prices. That's why the government has put, £94 billion into supporting people with the cost of living. But the government is absolutely focused on tackling those difficult issues. That's why things like getting the economy growing are so important and why we should be looking at what the IMF has said today.
Right, well, certainly this time, because they've revised their forecast up, having actually put it down for this year to minus 0.3%. They've revised it up to plus 0.4%, the International Monetary Fund, major financial agency. They are in town talking to the Treasury and to the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. Let's talk to our business reporter, Ben King. Ben, what do you make of the revised forecast?
So it's definitely improvement on what the IMF was saying about the UK economy in April. Back then, they were expecting a 0.3% shrink for this year. Now they're predicting the UK economy to grow by 0.4% and 1% next year. Definitely an improvement, but I think, as you heard Jeremy Hunt say there, there's work still to be done. I think 1% would be less than any government would want to see the economy growing at any time, really. And they identify some of the factors which are holding the UK economy back. Stubbornly high inflation, they say. They also call attention to that issue that has been in the headlines a lot lately, the idea of lots of people being out of the workforce, particularly long-term sick. There are 2.5 million people out of the workforce because of long-term sickness, and that's one of the things that's holding the economy back. They also weigh into the migration debate and say that the UK might want to consider using more workers from overseas to plug gaps in the labour market. So overall, an improved picture. We're no longer bottom of the G7 league table of advanced industrial nations. We're now above Germany, but there's still lots of progress to be made.
Now, what did you make of Jeremy Hunt's reaction? It seemed quite muted, actually, which just might be his delivery, of course. And we're also getting inflation figures out tomorrow. No doubt he'll be crossing his fingers to some extent that it will finally slip below double digits.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the Chancellor was keen not to leave the impression that 1% growth was the summit of his ambitions. And inflation does remain a persistent problem. We'll see tomorrow the inflation figures for April, which will see a big drop from 10.1% to somewhere in the region of above 8%, but that's largely due to a technical factor because the big increases in energy bills that we saw last April no longer affect the year-on-year comparison, which is the number that you look at to give you the headline inflation rate. So that's going to improve, but it will take a long time still to get back to the 2% target. The IMF said today that it won't get back to the 2% target until 2025. That's 6 months later than it previously forecast. So it remains a persistent problem. But the governor of the Bank of England was also talking about this earlier today, and he says, while inflation remains higher than he expected back in February, he remains confident that it has turned the corner.
Ben King, thank you very much. So there is still pain to come in terms of higher prices. I mean, even if inflation has come down to what Ben King is saying, around 8.5%, that is still a massive squeeze on households and consumers, isn't it?
Yes, it is still really difficult for households, for businesses, and that's why the government was right to put all this support, the £94 billion package, into helping people with their energy bills and helping those on lowest incomes in particular. What I think is interesting about this IMF forecast, the IMF's a really important organisation, does good work across the world. Often we do outperform the IMF forecasts here in the UK, but they've actually, you know, this change is not just by luck. This is because some of the policies we have put in to help grow the economy.
Well, even the head of the IMF herself did say, yes, there were some decisive and authoritative steps taken by the authorities, but she also said it's the decline in energy prices.
There is more to do. The decline in energy prices has helped, but things like bringing in the affordable childcare to help more families with young children get into work, the work we've been doing with people with disabilities, very targeted to help them get into work. Well, that is all part of this strategy to help grow the economy.
You have to remember that actually, as you say, the IMF have revised their forecast. Up until today, they said since COVID, the UK was the worst performing economy in the G7. In fact, they were Office for National Statistics figures that put the UK on 0.4 minus 0.5%, smaller than before COVID.
Yeah, and we are doing an awful lot better than we were 6 months ago, a year ago, and that's why we need to keep on going with that.
So there are reasons to be cheerful, aren't there? You have to admit that.
Labour's far more ambitious. We only have to compare with the last Labour government 12 years ago and now 13 years of Conservatives been in power. We grew the economy at 2% every single year.
And then crashed it.
You only have to ask the British public about, do they feel better off? I mean, what they will say from the local elections is this is a government out of touch. It had nothing to offer on cost of living. It doesn't understand that everything from milk to eggs to bread, the basic staples have all gone up, cost of living's gone up, and people are really, really struggling. And I think that's why it's brilliant that our Shadow Chancellor set a very clear plan about creating jobs. We've got over 1 million vacancies. We've got to look at those green jobs and those opportunities in every part of our country. You've got to have an industrial strategy. The government scrapped it. If it's not working with businesses, no certainty, no clear plan.
But do you want to change the Keir Starmer's view and comments saying that the UK economy was the sick man of Europe on the basis, if inflation is coming down, the economy growth figures have been revised up, that the UK economy has turned a corner?
Well, not really, as you said. I mean, up until now, I mean, this has only been recent. We've performed the worst in the G7. You've got to be far more ambitious and you've got to have a plan.
I mean, it's a bit... It depends on how you look at the figures, really, because if you look, yes, this year we're predicted to be the lowest growth in the G7, but last year we were one of the highest. Then if you look over, you know, a longer period of time, we're very much in the middle. So it's and then they're projecting that between 2024 and 2028 we'll be the highest out of European countries in the G7. So it really depends. But I think, you know, of course that's not good enough. We don't want to be stuck at sort of 1% growth forever. We have had stagnant growth for a number of reasons for too many years. And at the moment, we don't seem to be reaching towards big supply-side reforms that our economy does need. Planning reform. It is nice to hear Keir Starmer, I think it was, talking about planning reform. I'd like to see what that looks like.
Because Conservative
in
MPs
their manifesto,
have
because they've scrapped the housing targets and not enough a change on that, because that is one of the biggest costs for people, of course.
You've got to invest to grow, though. You've got to invest to grow. What the government is doing is just little little projects, thinking that actually in the hope that this will grow the economy. It won't work like that. You've got to have an industrial strategy. You've got to create pathways into jobs. There's 1 million vacancies. You know, you've got to bring in investment. There's a whole range of things.
I don't think you want micromanagement, though. I think you just want to foster an environment where businesses are able to grow, and that's making sure you're not overly regulated and making sure the tax burden isn't cripplingly high. That's how you get growth, not from micromanagement from bureaucrats.
That's not the case. Look, over the last 15 years, we can't look over just the last year, the year before that. Over the last 15 years, since the crash, almost entirely under Tory rule, we've been the worst performing major economy on many levels.
True.
It is true. Average weekly earnings in 2008 were £474 in this country. They're still £474, give or take a pound in recent months. You know, wages are completely flat. We've lived in a completely different world over the last 15 years. If you're wealthy, you've benefited fantastically from all sorts of tax breaks by your party. If you're poor, then your wages haven't gone up, and now inflation is at 10%, which is largely a tax on the poor. No, we're focusing on the important thing, which is the economy serving working people? And it's not.
Right. Well, Vicky, that is a pretty damning indictment. And actually, when it comes to wages, we have seen graphs that have shown comparative jobs in other European countries. The UK has lagged behind.
Just look at the facts, actually. Since 2010, the UK economy has grown faster than France, Italy and Japan, 3 of the other members of the G7. So don't say that we've performed the worst, because we haven't. It's not true based on the facts. The government has also, over that period, been really focused on putting more money in the pockets of those on lowest incomes. And I'm very proud of that, because that's helped to lift many people out of poverty. We are also a country where other overseas investors want to invest in. Look at what was announced just last weekend, £18 billion worth of investment coming from Japan into the UK. We need to keep going on that and make sure that we support areas where we are world leaders and continue to do that.
Harry?
Investment's been dreadful in this country, especially since Brexit, which your party carried out. But if you really want to talk about your supposed attempts to help people on lower incomes in this country, you say you want levelling up. Why haven't you reformed council tax? Council tax is levied at 1.5% of the value of someone's home if you're in a poor area like Hartlepool. It's levied at less than 0.1% if you're living in a big house in Kensington and Chelsea. Your policies haven't actually helped people on lower incomes. You've done things like raise the lower income tax threshold, which largely helps middle and higher earners. So often your rhetoric hasn't actually matched the facts.
And increasing the national living wage, and introducing universal credit, and ensuring more people can get the skills that they need for the future. I absolutely, though, I'd much rather have 1 million vacancies than when Labour left us with 1 million young people not in employment, education or training. That's what I remember from the last years of the Labour government, of how nearly 1 million young people left without opportunities.
You've got to have an industrial strategy. You've got to work with businesses to create pathways into
jobs.
Don't talk over each other. Let
The
Vicky Jones, I'll come to
Chancellor
you,
has been focusing on delivering those economic priorities, delivering growth, halving inflation and reducing the deficit.
Well, hang on. Inflation isn't yet halved.
And that's what we continue to focus on, and it's so important.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a mission statement, certainly, but it is about delivery. Preet, what is it that Labour is going to do to radically transform the outcomes in terms of the economy? Because broadly speaking, Sir Keir Starmer is talking about continuing what the government is doing, but just doing it better.
Well, look, I mean, you know, we've set out our Green Prosperity Plan. We've made it very clear that we'll work with businesses. We will set that mission in terms of making sure we create jobs in different parts of the region.
Tax, for example?
You know, we'll have 19 million homes that need to be retrofitted. We need to create, you know, the very skill sets that to undertake that kind of big transformation. That's working with businesses. That's creating jobs locally. Of course, it's looking at business rate reform, working to have a proper industrial strategy. This government scrapped it. You can't have that level of certainty and grow the economy without these very basic policies in place.
And the tax burden that you mentioned, I mean, can there be any more improvement in the economy from your perspective if the tax burden isn't reduced?
Well, of course there can. Supply-side reforms in terms of, as I was saying, regulations, planning regulations, would be a massive boost of people's pockets if housing came down in cost, for example. But I think the tax burden is cripplingly high. I don't know if you saw today, but I think it was on the front of the Telegraph or the Times. Sir Nigel Wilson, who's the head of Legal and General, he was saying that London's falling behind not European financial centres, but the likes of New York, Hong Kong, etc., because of over-regulation and because of various tax raids by successive chancellors. So I do think when we're looking at... And also, one more thing that I don't think we've touched upon is a huge number of people, and increasingly so, huge number of people on out-of-work benefits. There's some crazy statistics, like 18% of people in Manchester
a high number of long-term sick
are on out-of-work benefits. So these are the sort of things, and I would like to know how how Labour would get those people back into work, because it is shocking that so many people are just living off the state.
We have said that the over 50s, we've looking at where the shortages are. I mean, one of the things that we're saying is work with the Migration Advisory Council. The government knows where the skill shortages are. Stop relying on migration. Create those pathways for British people to get those jobs.
Well, we're going to talk about migration.
But just quickly, I mean, what Emily's right. The tax burden on people is too high. It's 51% if you're a recent graduate and you're earning over £50,000. What I'd like to know from Labour is, if you're not about shifting the tax burden away from workers and onto wealth, which you don't seem to be about, what is the point of a Labour government? Because
I think that's really unfair. I think we have really been setting out what our ambition is in terms of how we address the tax burden. I mean, this is something
well, you're not going to tax the top 5%, are you? Which was a pledge by Keir Starmer, are you? I mean, that's been dropped. That would have been a shift in the tax burden.
Well, the windfall tax, for a start, right now helping and supporting people that could raise over £10 billion. The non-dom tax levy, making sure people that benefit from this country pay their taxes in this country.
The windfall tax. OK, great. We've taxed the oil and energy companies more. But what's happened? They've decided to take their investment elsewhere. Harbour Energy, for example, huge industry in Scotland.
Lack of leadership of
They're saying, oh, we're going to take our place over to Indonesia because we're going to be taxed less. You've got to think about the long-term consequences, even the medium-term consequences of these decisions. They sound great, they're populist, but actually they have a damaging effect on our economy.
So, I mean, they were taken on, of course, by the government too. Labour suggested it.
Well,
we'll come on to
why is it rubbish?
Hang on. Let's just stick with the windfall tax on oil and gas companies. I mean, you obviously thought that was the right thing to do because the government did it.
So one of the issues I have with the Labour Party is every time they announce a new tax that they would put in, then they spend that money 3, 4, 5 times in every single spending promise that they have. And when you look at Labour's current record, I mean, look at Labour in Wales and the disaster on the NHS. It's an absolute example that you cannot trust Labour on public services. I know we have problems in the NHS. That's why one of our priorities is cutting the waiting list. But look at the disaster in Labour-run Wales.
Right. Well, what do you want to say? Something about the government? Of course, economically speaking, the performance has been broadly the same between Labour-run Wales and the rest of the UK economy.
Vicky, I can say to you, I'm out on the doors regularly, and the 13 destructive years of this government, people want change. I mean, what you have done to the NHS in terms of waiting lists, constantly relying on migration, not having pathways, not increasing training places.
Absolutely.
You know, I have hospitals in my constituency.
Come to my constituency and see my new medical school.
You're the one that
where under the Conservatives we are training doctors in Essex for the first time in history.
All right, I'm going to let
Harry and see the investment that's happening.
You talk about investing to grow, and this country does want that. If you look at the polls, they do want that now. But it's not clear where you're willing to shift the tax burden. You know, you're not committing to equalising capital gains tax rates with the rates of income. You're not committing to reforming council tax. You're not committing to doing anything about the way that inheritance tax works in this country. So it's not you don't want an annual wealth tax. So it's not clear how you're going to shift the tax burden and actually improve.
How many times
let's talk.
If you tax wealth, yes, OK, sounds great, but then it's depleted for the next year. And if you look at France, for example, where they introduced it, they had to keep going back and forth with it because it simply didn't work.
So if you
let
Harry answer.
Than ever been.
That's true.
We've got a net outflow of high net worth individuals in this country.
How many?
Is that a good thing?
Hang on.
1,000 last year. So we are losing tax revenue. You've got to be careful with these policies because they sound nice, they sound great. I don't want to be paying as much tax as I am right now. I don't want graduates to either. But you've got to be careful with these policies because actually, if you drain wealth from the country, it's not for our net benefit.
Yeah, but it's not what the data says. So, no, it's not. Look at Aaron Advani's work. Anonymised Treasury receipts show that if you shift the tax burden, for instance, with non-dom changes, it doesn't lead to a big increase in migration. You've got to call the bluff. The tax rate on people with estates over 10 million in this country is 10%. The tax rate on graduates is 50%. The tax rate, if you earn your money as a speculator investing in stocks and shares, is 20%. The tax rate for the rest of us on income tax is 40%.
All right, we're going to stop there because well, look, let's talk about immigration and levels of migration because you've all mentioned it one way or another. We've got Madeleine Sumption, the director of the Migration Observatory at Oxford University, with us. Madeleine, I think we've just had a written ministerial statement on immigration, particularly to do with dependence on students, on foreign students coming here who have been granted visas. I'm going to just have a brief read of it while you answer the question broadly what we're expecting on Thursday, which are the net migration figures. They have been forecast to go up to a record of 700,000. That would be the highest ever immigration figure in recent times. Why? What's driving these high figures?
Well, I don't want to speculate about exactly what the figures will be later this week. What we can say is that it is an unusually high level, and there are three main factors that are driving that. We have the war in Ukraine and the fact that a substantial number of Ukrainians came over last year fleeing the war. You then have an increase in the number of international students coming. A very significant increase that I expect we'll be talking about more. And then alongside that, you have larger numbers of people coming on skilled work visas. And that number is particularly driven by people coming into the health and care sector.
Right. Well, I've just read it here. Yes, the package that's been announced in terms of tackling immigration is removing the right for international students to bring dependents unless they are on postgraduate courses currently designated as research programmes. Madeleine, while you're there, I'm just going to show our audience and our guests. They can see the surge in numbers in terms of visas issued to dependents of those on sponsored study visas. And you can see the big jump there in 21 to 22. Will that make a big difference, removing that right for international students to bring over dependents unless they're on these specific courses?
Well, it depends what you mean a difference too. In terms of overall numbers, last year around 10% of all visas issued in the UK were to the family members of international students. So it's likely to have some impact, that restriction. Most of the, not all, but most of those would be to the family members of master's students. In terms of the broader social impacts, social economic impacts, I would expect actually, like many individual immigration policy decisions, that the impact, the economic impacts would not be huge. Probably the impacts would fall primarily on people who choose still to come to the UK and are separated from their family members. Obviously, some other students will decide that they don't want to come at all, and so the UK might become slightly less attractive to international students.
Well, Madeleine, stay with us. I'm just going to open up the discussion to our panel here. Vicky, do you welcome the news about removing the right to for international students to bring dependents over?
So clearly, you know, we've had very high levels of migration for all sorts of different reasons, Ukraine,
we've heard
Hong
all that,
Kong,
yeah.
etc. And it's right that we've supported those who are facing really huge troubles. There has been this really big increase in the dependence of international students. International students are really important to our universities. We've got world-leading universities. They need international students. But speaking to universities, they are concerned about this rise in dependence and how do they support them. So I think that this suggestion, which I want to go and look at the detail, that says if you're coming on a research programme that you could still bring your dependent, means that potentially, you know, the future Einsteins that we want to come and have working in the R&D in the UK, they can still come with their families, but not if you're here for a one-year graduate course. That may be a sensible balance.
Do you welcome it?
Well, look, there's clear chaos and confusion as far as I'm concerned, because the government's own figures are that it wants to get to 600,000 students by 2030. And now we know that 95% of students actually go back to their respective countries. So I don't know what the government is talking about, because they contribute 26 billion to the economy. What the issue is that the Migration Advisory Council have been saying for a long time there are people with skill shortages that we have known for about 15 odd years. But the government has no plan to ease us away from sort of speaking to businesses and saying we can't just constantly rely on immigration to fill the jobs. We've got to create pathways. That's exactly what Labour is saying, to get those jobs for British people.
Right. I'm slightly unclear as to what Labour's position. Do you support the idea of curbs on foreign students bringing over dependents, or do you not?
My understanding is it was government policy. It's recently been changed, and that's why the figures have gone up.
But what's your policy?
Yes, we would broadly support that. We'd have to look at the detail. But clearly, there's a bigger issue about how do we bring net migration figures down. And I think this
we'll come on to it. But this is the issue that's certainly coming up today in terms of student visas. I mean, it is a contradiction, Vicky, because the government's policy was to encourage as many foreign students as possible, and with that, dependents could come over because of the economic boost to the economy. So there's a complete turnaround here.
So overseas students do provide a huge amount to our university.
So why curb their right to bring over dependents?
The amount of dependents, you know, we have to bear in mind the pressure it puts on local services, local housing, etc. It does. Okay, it does in certain areas put a huge pressure on. So I think that this is a sensible measure.
Why do you say it doesn't?
Because it's not as if 135,000 dependents are suddenly moving to the UK permanently. What's happening is people are coming over for a master's course, they're coming over for a postgraduate course, and they have the right to bring a partner and maybe children. That's fine. Most of the time they're going to leave. If they're not, if they're not going to leave, then they're probably going to be an economic contributor to the country. We need this money. We need international students to fund our university system. Either that or taxes, which I know you all love, are going to have to go up. So we've got to do one or the other. It's all part of the whole system here. And we're acting as if sort of families are bringing over people who have no economic contribution and they're staying here for the long term. That's just simply not the case.
Emily?
May I just say that you actually don't know if the vast majority are going back.
You do.
The ONS doesn't collect that data, and they've said that they don't actually know whether these students are emigrating and returning.
Well, I think
government's own figures are saying 95%.
They do.
We don't know that. The ONS actually doesn't collect that data.
We've got Madeleine.
And it looks like
we've got Madeleine. We've got Madeleine Sumption here. Madeleine, what is the sort of best data we have on how many foreign students return home after they've completed their studies, or within a year or so?
So we do have reasonably good data on this. Typically, if you look over a period of sort of 5 to 8 years, the large majority of people will not extend and go on to other visas. So, more than 80% will see their visas expire. And then we have separate data that suggests that compliance is pretty high. So people do tend to return home after their visas expire.
Emily, what do you say? So the majority, if they do go back, they are only here for a fixed period of time, maybe a year or so after they finish their courses.
I think the Home Office is concerned that people come on to do these short courses for, say, 9 months, and then they extend through a visa graduate, which allows them to bring family over and then also work. So people are using sort of the university system to get a worker's visa. And I think that is something that happens. And I'm rather confused how... I think bringing dependents, I don't think that's too controversial that people would say, well, hang on a minute, we've got a housing crisis, our public services are looking pretty tricky at the moment. Surely we want to reduce that burden. Yes to students, but you can't bring, your kid and your grandma and your...
Not bringing your grandma. That's a complete misunderstanding of what they are. Yeah. You're not bringing elderly parents, adults, and so forth. You're bringing your partner and children, and your partner is more likely than not, if you're a graduate doing a postgrad in this country, your partner is more likely than not also going to be an economic contributor. We can see in the data that they're economic contributors.
So when I talk to my local university...
Well, hang on. Let's come to that. Let's come to... Well, wait a minute. No. But let's come, because we've cleared up the fact that actually it seems from the figures that most students do return home, and presumably with their families. There is a bit of switching, as it so happens, for students whose visas ended in the academic year 2018 to 2019. According to the figures, 35% successfully applied for new visas and stayed in the UK. That was a specific time period taken. But in terms of their value to the economy, £26 billion. Where have you got those figures from?
So these are figures that are out there. They're readily
from the
available
universities.
From not just universities. These are government data as well. Let's not forget, the government's target by 2030 is to increase the international students, and it's very expensive to come and study here, actually, compared to a lot of other places. So the contribution is huge. And as you said previously, universities say to me, without international students, who is going to subsidise?
Wow. So if you're curbing the right of foreign students to bring dependents over, there will be, I think Madeleine said, some sort of effect on the economy. What will happen then? Higher tuition fees or government help?
So let me go back to my local example. My university in Chelmsford also has a campus in Cambridge, a campus in Peterborough. At least 2 of those areas. It's already a huge amount of pressure on local housing, and there is a real issue on housing the dependents when they're coming over because of housing issues. So what they said to me is we want to make sure that we can still give stability to those who... why this might be sensible is because it's looking at those who are longer term in a research programme, therefore bringing their families over, rather than families who are coming for a shorter period of time for shorter courses. And therefore, I think this may be a very sensible move at this stage.
May I just say one thing? As I understand it, the Labour Party support cutting down on dependents, bringing in these cuts. And secondly, I don't understand how we can be talking about how awful it would be to reduce or curb numbers of dependents when this year has been so considerably higher than any other. And I don't know why, because what was wrong with 2019 when we had 135,000 students and 16,000 dependents, and now we have 485,000
well, I can explain that.
And 135,000
Because
dependents.
we want, the whole point is there's been a policy shift because we want international students to come over here because they subsidise our system. And so one follows the other. You'll have more dependents if you have more international students. Hang on, the key point to make here is immigration is something that fits with everything else in society. If you are going to have a policy, because you say they're good economic contributors of having more international students come over, then you are right. We need to fund at a local level things like housing. So it all goes together. You have to have planning reform at the same time. But the idea that we shouldn't have economically beneficial students come over seems to be cutting off our nose.
And I'm absolutely not saying that.
But that's what
Well, then briefly before we move in,
policy
can I
will
just
do.
say, so how will you bring down? Hang on, how will you bring down net migration, which is what Rishi Sunak says he is committed to doing?
So the Prime Minister, of course, is looking at that because of the pressure that we've seen elsewhere in the system. I do agree that we also need to invest in skills and training for local people, as well as being open to the world. I'm a one-nation Conservative and absolutely believe that we can't look at the UK as an island
So how are you going to bring it down?
So we need to look at areas like this. I think this may be a very sensible, targeted policy. And we need to make sure that we have a migration system that supports those who need it most and those who support our economy.
And what level would Labour bring it down to?
Look, net migration figures will come down, especially because of the Ukrainian visas and Hong Kong. That's a one-off thing, and that's not going to continue. We'll see Ukrainians returning back, and of course, there's a cap now on those.
And what is a
visas that are
sustainable
being
level
issued.
for the UK, do you think?
Well, look, I think you've got to look at how it works for the economy and all aspects of it. I think the biggest issue is about skills. We have got to wean ourselves off. We've got to have a strategy in this country. We are extracting vital resource from other countries like NHS workers, doctors, social care staff, and we've constantly been reliant on that. And we've got to have a different alternative pathway, which is exactly what Labour is saying. We are working closely with Migration Advisory Council. We understand the skills different regions need. That is the way of the future. That is how you grow the economy.
You go on then, Harry, and I'll get a final
Just quickly, I just think, look, take a step back. Brexit was extraordinarily successful in cutting EU migration. It's now negative, okay? But at the same time, we've massively liberalised immigration to the rest of the world, which was, of course, not what I think many people thought they were voting for.
Well, I thought about taking back control, Harry, and deciding what the levels of immigration would be and where it would come from.
Well, absolutely, and so that's fair. That's the point, is to say to the public that we do need immigrants, and we're having a bit of a strange debate here where Labour are sort of both for and against this policy.
That's absolutely not true. What's happened is that with the trade deals comes the whole issue about visas, and this is what the government's grappling with. Labour's not trying to do both. Labour is saying that, of course, we're going to have to rely for a short period of time in terms of getting
how short is that period of time? 10 years?
Well, no, I'm not. What I'm saying is our plan to recruit and train more doctors. Of course, it will take more time, but you've got to have a pathway and a plan.
Let's get a final word.
Actually,
Madeleine, hang on a second.
That's not fair. The Prime Minister had been at the G7 this week, leading the global discussion on how you tackle migration. Migration is a global issue, and we are working with our partners in a leading role in tackling this global
for other
issue.
migration. That's the issue here.
And on that, we'll wait to hear for the figures. But Madeleine Sumption, do you have a final word on this issue before we wrap this up?
I think, no, the only thing to say is that there's a lot of discussion about the overall numbers of migrants coming to the UK, and I think it's quite difficult to have that discussion about what is the right number without actually just talking about the individual policies that let people in or not, because the government policy does not dictate the numbers. You can have the same policy and numbers will change over time. So what really matters is the conversation about each of those individual categories, care workers, people in the NHS, international students, rather than just kind of these more fictional numbers. Will it be 500,000, 400,000 or what have you?
Madeleine Sumption, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about vaping. This headline today, following a BBC investigation, high lead and nickel found in illegal vapes. It was an investigation into vapes taken from a school, and they found, once they tested them, high levels, as I say, of lead, nickel and chromium. The laboratory showed that children using them could be inhaling lead that's over twice the daily safe amount and 9 times over the safe amount of nickel. Let's hear from John Dunn, who is from the UK Vaping Industry Association.
We've called on the government to look at raising the fines on rogue retailers who sell to children up to £10,000 per instance. And it baffles us why the government isn't taking that action if the industry itself is actually calling for it and won't object to it. All vape retailers should be licensed, and part of that licensing should be that they have robust age verification processes in place.
do we need precisely what John Dunn has said? All vape retailers should be licensed, and part of that licensing should be that they have these verification processes in place.
So I've certainly been out and about with my local police into local vape shops, reminding them of the need not to sell to under 18-year-olds.
And what have you seen? Have you seen rows of...
As a result of that, one of the shops was busted by the police for selling illegal vapes and selling them to
But what if it was £10,000 per instance? Do you think that would stop them?
So I think, and the government is looking at this issue of how they're going to tackle especially the sale of these vapes to children. It is illegal. One of the good things I saw actually when I went out with my police is the fact that we've now got record numbers of police in Essex and across the country.
Well, let's stick with the vape.
They can go and tackle these types of issues.
Fine, but that isn't about regulation. Should there be stricter regulation? I've heard so many parents say they don't know how their 13-year-old is getting a cherry-flavoured vape from a shop when they are clearly underage, and now this stuff is containing this sort of toxic levels.
I'm really concerned as a former children's minister at the impact this is having on children. I think it's good that the government's looking at. We need to have stronger enforcement. I think we should look at the taxation and how this compares to other forms of nicotine products as well. My colleague, who's an NHS paediatrician, who's a member of Parliament, Caroline Johnson, has proposed a 10-minute rule bill on this as well. So we are working on this and it does need to be
What would Labour do? Because the regulator doesn't really have enough powers to do the sorts of things that Vicky's outlined.
Yeah, I mean, I think we will take much tougher, stringent action, especially for young people. I mean, I was quite horrified. My daughter was telling me about girls vaping in her school. And, you know, I know teachers are really grappling with this. It's a very difficult situation because what they're seeing is the impact of not being able to
So what would you do? What would you do to stop young children getting hold of these vapes?
Well, of course, we've got to do more than what currently is happening because, of course, you know, it's already illegal in terms of being able to access it for under 18.
Would you have £10,000 fines?
Well, I don't
would you have a robust licensing service?
What I'm saying is we're looking at this. This is a real big public health concern for us. I mean, I think it's a good tool for adults in terms of weaning them off smoking, but of course we shouldn't be, you know, talking about young people putting themselves at such level of risk at this stage without doing anything about it.
I mean, Preet raises the point. It was always seen as a way of weaning smokers off cigarettes, that it was better than smoking cigarettes. And then there has been this unforeseen, I don't know, inadvertent consequence that actually kids who weren't smoking or may never have smoked have ended up vaping.
Yeah, I think this is a question of enforcing the law. It's nice to hear Vicky's been out and about trying to do that with the police because these shops should not be selling to children. And it's very easy to order these things on Amazon, on Deliveroo, whatever it is, whatever your retailer of choice is, you can get hold of them. And there are tutti frutti flavours that clearly are marketed towards children. But I think this is about enforcing the law that already exists. I don't think we want to go down the Australia route and ban them all because then what you have, and I've spoken to Australians about this, you just have a black market and people are vaping just as they were before, and you can just get it. And this is where these illegal ones come. These will be everywhere because, you know, those are the ones you'll be able to get on the black market. So I don't think we go as far as banning. We maybe some restrictions on the way they're marketed because they are really, they're like highlighter pens, aren't they?
What would you do, Harry? I mean, it's true. Australia, I think you can only get vapes on prescription. So only, I suppose, if you're a smoker trying to quit.
I don't think this is a very complicated issue. I'm glad to hear Emily's in favour of a little regulation. I think this is obviously what we need here. We need the enforcement of it. If the industry itself is calling for these measures, then who's going to object to them?
Well, but so why isn't it happening? I mean, if manufacturers can so easily sell them...
We did say we'll ban it for children, but the government voted against it. They voted against it. Vicky, you voted against it.
I'm going to say something here, actually.
It's banned for children.
I agree with you on this is a complicated issue because actually vaping does help to get people off smoking cigarettes. And therefore one does need to look at this carefully. But when I've been speaking to people, these new disposable vapes are very, very high level of nicotine. And you've got young people taking these very high levels of nicotine. So that is right. That is why it's right that the government is looking at how we try and enforce this legislation, protect children, how we work with schools and with parents on awareness here.
On the other side.
And also have the police, the record numbers of police, to help enforce some of these issues.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. And I will be back, of course, tomorrow. It's Prime Minister's Questions here on Politics Live at 11:15. Prime Minister's Questions is actually at midday, but the programme starts at 11:15. Please join me, and it'll be on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us, bye-bye.